This is the Nourished Brain Podcast, where we explore the art and science of nutrition for brain health and mental well-being. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. I'm your host, Sarah Thompson-Fajera. Let's get started. Today, I decided to focus in on one of the most common brain-boosting rituals in the world, which of course has to do with all things caffeinated beverages. Whether it's morning coffee, afternoon tea, energy drinks, chocolates, caffeine is readily accessible for many of us. But you may have wondered, what exactly does caffeine do in your brain? And what is that sweet spot where caffeine can provide focus, but you're not left feeling jittery? And what about the long-term effects? What impact might, say, coffee and tea have on our long-term ability to think and remember? So thinking first about short-term effects of caffeine. Caffeine can act pretty quickly. When it enters the bloodstream, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and begins to block what are known as adenosine receptors. And adenosine is a chemical that basically can tell our brain we're tired. It will build throughout the day to help us eventually to fall asleep. And so when caffeine comes in and blocks these receptors, any adenosine that's present isn't able to bind to the receptors. And so all of a sudden, we're counteracting that effect and we'll feel more alert. And it's interesting that even a small amount, 50 to 100 milligrams of caffeine, can occupy up to half of your brain's adenosine receptors, which can increase alertness, improve memory recall. You may have experienced in the past another benefit of better mood and motivation, in part because caffeine can actually boost levels of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine being a neurotransmitter that will impact overall motivation to complete different tasks on our to-do list. Another benefit is enhanced physical and mental endurance. By mobilizing fatty acids and increasing adrenaline, caffeine can actually improve our stamina. But of course, there can be cons as well when it comes to caffeine and how we're feeling, mental health, focus, etc. Common symptoms of too much caffeine can include restlessness, nervousness, feeling irritable. And it's really important to note that caffeine can have an unexpected impact on sleep because its half-life can be longer than sometimes people realize. So in younger adults, the half-life of caffeine seems to be about 3 to 5 hours, where the caffeine is going to be working itself out of your system. But some individuals, based on genetics, are slower or faster metabolizers. And in older adults, the half-life of caffeine seems to increase, where it's closer to 6 to 10 hours. And if someone has any kind of kidney problems, reduced kidney clearance, that can increase your blood levels of caffeine, keep it around longer. And so sometimes between age, genetics, individuals can really feel these more exaggerated effects or feel the effects longer Now, if you're someone who experiences some more of that sense of jitteriness or overstimulation, even with small amounts of, say, coffee, an option can be to opt for green tea or matcha, which contains L-theanine. The presence of the L-theanine can help to buffer some of the more stimulating effects of the caffeine. Let's talk a little bit about the sleep impact of caffeine as well here. Lingering caffeine in our systems can actually fragment deep sleep. And this deep sleep is so critical because it's the stage of sleep where the brain clears toxins via the lymphatic system, helps to clear things out. And so if afternoon coffee intake, tea intake could be impacting sleep health, sleep quality, it definitely could be worth just reflecting and asking yourself, is having some caffeine later in the day really helping productivity, or could it actually be adversely impacting you the next day? So some things to consider there. Okay, so shifting now to thinking about some of the longer term effects of caffeine. It's interesting that there have been a number of studies that have been done on caffeine and cognitive decline. So, for example, a 2024 meta-analysis that included 22 prospective studies and 11 case control studies with almost 400,000 participants between all of them, found that coffee and tea consumption were linked to a lower risk of cognitive disorders. For Alzheimer's disease specifically, the meta-analysis showed that peak protection was gained at 2.5 cups per day, and there was a linear relationship between tea and Alzheimer's disease prevention, where there was a decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease of 11% for every additional cup of tea per day. And in their analysis, the authors did point out that stronger protection was observed in men, and that ethnicity and outcome type did influence some of the associations within groups. Thinking about mental health outcomes, just recently, in September of 2025, there was a paper published that was exploring the impact and mechanisms of coffee on depression, anxiety, and sleep disorders. And some of the findings were that moderate intake of coffee could improve depressive behavior through some different pathways: anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and neurotransmitter regulation pathways. And the sweet spot here, based on the epidemiological, the population-based evidence, seemed to be that 2 to 3 cups of coffee per day was significantly associated with a reduced risk of depression, noting that clinical results were inconsistent, so not across the board, but generally speaking. And some of the variability the authors were suggesting could be related to dose and some of those individual differences and how quickly people clear caffeine, perhaps even coffee type. Overall, these are just a few thoughts and considerations related to caffeine and its short-term and longer-term effects on the brain. The good news, then, all in all, is that caffeine really can sharpen focus, boost motivation, as many of you have likely noticed. but it can be easy to overdo. So when you're thinking about moderation and timing and awareness of how caffeine impacts our bodies and our brains, consider these guidelines that we've covered today. So staying in that sweet spot of 100 to 400 milligrams per day. Being cautious around time of day that you're having caffeine. Being thoughtful, especially as we age, remembering that half-life may increase. And considering tea, considering matcha for a gentler form of energy where you have some of that buffer against the stimulation. I hope this was helpful to think through caffeine, your relationship with it. I'll leave you with this reflection question. When it comes to these beverages that are so loved, our coffee and our caffeinated tea, think for yourself, are you drinking caffeine in the amounts that allows you to experience the best of the benefits, both short-term and long-term? Thank you for listening to the Nourished Brain Podcast. If today's episode inspired you, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use it. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay nourished.